Some stories don't begin with fireworks. They begin in silence, in the subtle shift of a gaze, or the quiet courage of a woman who refuses to be shaken. In a world that often confuses noise with power, one teacher reminded us that true strength is found in grace, patience, and unwavering purpose. This is the story of a rich boy who mocked his black teacher, only to be led gently but firmly toward a truth he never expected. For those of us who've weathered life's lessons, this tale strikes a familiar chord. Sometimes the deepest transformations come not through punishment, but through presence. It began with a voice, loud, sarcastic, and careless, cutting through the calm of a classroom like a blade. "Who even reads this stuff anymore?" the boy jeered from the back row, slouched in his designer hoodie, dripping with entitlement. His name was Preston Cavanaugh, just 16, but already wearing the invisible armor of wealth, privilege, and ignorance. The other students chuckled, not out of amusement, but out of habit. They laughed because he was the kind of boy others always laughed with, even when they didn't understand the joke. And then he did the unthinkable. With a smug grin, he mocked his teacher's accent, twisting it into a cruel caricature and lacing it with a reference to slavery so grotesque the room itself seemed to recoil. Ms. Nayan Caldwell, the new teacher, elegant, poised, and black, stood at the board, chalk in hand, unmoving. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't slam her books. She didn't flinch. Instead, she looked at him, really looked at him, with eyes that held more history, more pain, and more power than Preston could begin to fathom. That silence, that stillness, was not weakness. It was resolve. For those of us who have lived long enough to see both change and resistance to it, this moment cuts deep. It echoes a lifetime of moments when dignity had to speak louder than insult, when silence had to hold the weight of centuries. Ms. Caldwell didn't respond with anger because she carried something more enduring. The strength of every teacher, parent, and elder who's ever had to hold their head high in the face of ignorance. And so, with just a name, Preston, spoken calmly, she began a lesson not found in textbooks. A lesson not just for him, but for every witness in that room, because sometimes the most powerful teaching moments begin not with lectures or punishment, but with an invitation to grow, to see, to change. There's a kind of strength that doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to slam a desk, raise a hand, or fight back with fury. It's the strength of stillness, the kind that comes from deep roots in lived wisdom. Ms. Nayan Caldwell had that strength. When Preston Cavanaugh mocked her voice, her heritage, her presence in that classroom, she didn't fire back with anger. She simply turned, walked to her desk, and reached for a notebook. No yelling, no reprimand, just calm, measured, intentional. She called his name, not as an accusation, but as an invitation. "You'll be staying after class today," she said, her voice as even as a still pond. Preston smirked, expecting a lecture or detention. What he didn't realize was that he had just stepped into a deeper kind of classroom, one where truth would be the curriculum and humility the first assignment. Older Americans, especially those who've raised children, mentored others, or taught through example, know the rare value of this kind of restraint. They've learned that the most lasting lessons aren't taught in the heat of emotion, but in the quiet aftermath. Ms. Caldwell wasn't reacting. She was responding, thoughtfully, purposefully, and most of all, powerfully. She didn't reach for punishment. She reached for transformation. What Preston thought would be a game, a chance to provoke, to show off, to push limits, was met not with discipline, but with dignity. In that small gesture of handing him an unmarked folder and asking him to come back with an answer, she redefined what authority looks like. She didn't demand respect. She inspired it. For anyone who's ever been underestimated, for every woman who's ever been doubted because of her voice, her background, or the color of her skin, Ms. Caldwell's moment of unshakable calm is more than admirable. It's revolutionary. And for those who've lived long enough to know that anger burns fast but wisdom endures, her response is a quiet anthem. She didn't lower herself to his level. She asked him to rise. And in doing so, she reminded us all that the most profound kind of power isn't in control, it's in conviction. When the final bell rang that afternoon, the hallway buzzed with adolescent chatter. squeaking sneakers, and the familiar rhythm of backpacks being zipped. But Preston Kavanaugh didn't move. So Caldwell sat at her desk, unbothered by the rush of dismissal, and waited, not for an apology, but for something far more meaningful. Without a word, she reached into her drawer and pulled out a worn manila folder. No name, no markings, just the soft edges of something that had been touched by time. She slid it across the desk like it was made of glass. "You'll open that when you get home," she said, her voice gentle but steady, "and you'll come back tomorrow with your answer." Preston blinked. "Answer to what?" She smiled, just enough to unsettle him. "To whether you want to keep pretending, or if you're ready to learn something real." For older Americans who've raised children, guided generations, or simply watched the world shift from certainty to chaos and back again, this moment echoes the timeless truth. Almost truth. True teaching is never about control, it's about awakening. What Ms. Caldwell handed him wasn't homework. It was a mirror, a quiet call to accountability, a challenge that couldn't be graded but had the power to shape a life. Preston took the folder home but couldn't bring himself to open it. He tossed it onto his marble desk in his high-rise room, full of luxury and silence. He distracted himself with videos and lights, but the folder sat there, waiting, not accusing, just existing, like a door he was too proud to walk through, yet too shaken to ignore. And in that quiet space between resistance and curiosity, something inside him shifted. Because the truth of Ms. Caldwell's lesson wasn't in her words, it was in her certainty. She didn't have to convince him. She didn't need to beg for change. She knew something he didn't yet understand. Real learning begins the moment we stop pretending we already know. And so the folder stayed closed that night. But the door to something deeper, older, and truer, had already begun to crack open. The folder didn't open easily, not because it was sealed, but because something inside Preston Kavanaugh resisted. Still, something in Ms. Caldwell's eyes had unsettled him, made the silence around him louder than usual. When he finally lifted the flap, he found a single black and white photo, an elderly black man sitting alone on a weathered bench. Below the image, one name, Hollis Dent. On the back, just 5 words, "Find him, listen, no excuses." Preston didn't ask his father's driver to take him. He didn't want the tinted Escalade or the smooth ride through town. Instead, he took the city bus, transferred twice, and landed somewhere far from his Buckhead bubble. The streets were cracked, the storefronts faded, but there was something undeniably honest about it all. And there, just like in the photo, sat Mr. Dent. Same suit, same stare. A sentinel of history waiting for a boy who thought he'd seen the world. "You the boy Nyan sent?" the old man asked without turning. Preston nodded. "I guess." "Don't guess," Mr. Dent replied. "Either you are or you ain't." And so began a conversation unlike any Preston had ever known. Not a lecture, not a sermon, but a living archive. Mr. Dent spoke of marching with Dr. King once, just once, before being beaten so hard by a cop's baton he couldn't stand straight for weeks. He talked of being called bourgeois by men in uniform, of walking 5 miles to school while buses full of white children sped past him, and of a mother who lost her job for speaking the truth at a PTA meeting. Preston didn't interrupt. He didn't smirk or scoff. He just listened. For older Americans who lived through or remember the echoes of this time, Mr. Dent is more than a character. He's a keeper of sacred memory. He represents every man and woman who carried burdens so others might walk lighter. His voice is the kind we wish more young people would hear, not through screens, but across a bench, eye to eye, heart to heart. By the time Preston left, the folder felt heavier in his hands, not because of its contents, but because of what it now symbolized. A truth too long ignored, and a wisdom too precious to forget. Some lessons don't come with a red pen or a letter grade. They come with the weight of another person's story. When Preston Kavanaugh left Mr. Dent that afternoon, he wasn't walking away from a lecture. He was walking away from a life he'd never bothered to imagine. The folder he had so carelessly tossed aside days earlier now felt like it carried the echoes of generations, the invisible ink of pain, resilience, and unspoken truths. For the first time, Preston wasn't angry, arrogant, or amused. He was quiet. That silence followed him into the next morning when he returned to Ms. Caldwell's classroom. No smirk, No swagger, just presence. She didn't ask what he thought, didn't demand a report. Instead, she handed him a second envelope, smaller than the first. "This is your next step," she said, "if you're serious." He didn't argue. He didn't roll his eyes. He just took it. Inside was a destination, Birmingham, Alabama, Civil Rights Institute, Saturday, 10:30 a.m. And so Preston went, not in a Bentley, not by private jet, but on a Greyhound bus alone. He wasn't running toward answers. He was walking toward accountability. And as the wheels rolled through unfamiliar highways, he felt the growing sense that this wasn't about school anymore. This was about becoming a human being. The Birmingham Civil Rights Institute didn't lecture him. It whispered. In the quiet of its halls, Preston stood face to face with a burned church shoe once worn by Addie Mae Collins, a 14-year-old girl killed in the 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. It was just a shoe, torn, soot-covered, child-sized, but it held more grief than any textbook ever could. There were photos, voices, blood on pavement, mothers who buried their sons, teachers who crossed lines no curriculum dared to draw. And standing among it all was Ms. Caldwell, no longer just a teacher, but a witness, a survivor, a bridge between what was and what must never be again. To the seasoned heart, these truths strike chords long dormant. They remind us that real education doesn't happen at a desk. It happens when a soul is stirred, when denial is peeled away, and something raw is left behind. What Preston discovered wasn't just a dark history, it was his own ignorance, unmasked. He had mocked, but now he understood. Punishment might correct behavior, but truth, when fully felt, transforms character. Preston arrived in Birmingham just after 10:00 a.m., the southern sun already casting sharp shadows across the stone steps of the Civil Rights Institute. He didn't dress up, didn't try to impress, no entourage, no privilege, no performance, just a young man carrying a notebook and a question heavier than pride. A security guard quietly pointed him toward a side entrance. Someone had clearly been expecting him. Inside, it was cool and still. The walls didn't shout, but they whispered, echoes of children walking into schools lined with screaming crowds, of marchers beaten for daring to demand dignity. Every photo, every artifact seemed to meet Preston's eyes with a silent challenge. "Are you ready to see now?" He met Ms. Caldwell near the entrance to the main exhibit. She wasn't dressed like a teacher, no clipboard, no lectures, just jeans, a simple shirt, and the look of someone who had walked this path before. "This isn't a school trip," she said. "You don't get extra credit." Preston nodded. "I know." They walked in silence past the original jail door where Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. wrote his famous letter. Then came the display of the burned church shoe, the one worn by Addie Mae Collins, just 14 years old, when the bomb went off at the 16th Street Baptist Church. Preston stared at it, not out of morbid curiosity, but reverence. It didn't seem big enough to hold grief, yet it did. It held everything. And then the video came on. A black woman, older, her voice calm but steady, speaking about walking her child into an all-white school in 1961, crowds screaming, spitting, threatening. Preston turned to Ms. Caldwell. "That was you," he said softly. She nodded. "I didn't need the class to know, but you needed to." For those who've lived through decades of progress wrapped in pain, this moment is sacred. It honors the quiet heroism of ordinary people who carried this nation forward on their backs. Preston didn't speak. He couldn't. He was no longer a boy playing rebellion. He was a young man standing in the presence of history that had once been invisible to him. And for the first time in his life, he wasn't trying to win. He wasn't trying to impress. He was simply listening. And that, perhaps, was the first real sign that he was finally beginning to grow. Preston didn't speak much on the long ride home. The Greyhound bus rumbled steadily down southern highways, but inside him, everything had shifted. He didn't scroll through his phone. He didn't stare at his reflection in the darkened window. Instead, he watched the world outside as if seeing it for the first time. A rusted bridge tagged with graffiti. A mural of John Lewis on a brick wall. A street sign he'd passed 100 times without noticing. The silence wasn't awkward. It was sacred. For the first time, Preston was alone with his thoughts. And that solitude was no longer empty. It was full. Cradled in his hands was a notebook, blank pages that had once meant nothing to him. But now they called to him. Ms. Caldwell had handed it to him as they left the Civil Rights Institute. "Start writing," she said. "Anything, reactions, questions, lies you've told yourself, things you never questioned until now." He had clutched it on the bus like it might break if mishandled. And then, somewhere near the Alabama state line, he opened it, slowly, tentatively. And he wrote, "I used to think history was boring because it wasn't about me." Then he paused. But maybe it was. Maybe it always was. I just didn't want to see how. For older generations who've lived through the rise and fall of movements, through battles both public and personal, there is something deeply familiar in this kind of awakening. It's the moment when a young person stops trying to be right and starts trying to be real. Preston wasn't just taking notes. He was unraveling himself. Back at school on Monday, he came in early, 5 minutes before the bell, notebook in hand, expression different. He asked quietly if he could read something aloud. And for once, the room fell silent. Not out of obligation, but respect. Even Ms. Caldwell leaned back in her chair, her head tilted in quiet anticipation. And Preston read, not a paper, not a speech, but a truth he had written from his own hand, his own reckoning. There were no jokes, no bravado, just a voice that had once mocked, now trembling with clarity. He didn't ask for applause. He didn't expect forgiveness. He simply shared his growth. Because sometimes the most powerful transformation doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with a young man finally choosing to listen. By Friday morning, word had spread. Ms. Caldwell's classroom filled before the first bell even rang. Not with noise, but with anticipation. Students who weren't even in her class leaned against the back wall, whispering. Something was different. Something was coming. And at the center of it all stood Preston Cavanaugh, not the smug boy who had mocked his teacher, but a young man holding a folded piece of paper in one hand and his notebook in the other. No slides, no theatrics, just him, standing bare before a room he had once tried to dominate. "I didn't write a paper," he began, his voice quieter than expected. "I wrote something else." And he read, slowly, honestly, not from a place of performance, but from the cracks left behind after pride has been chipped away. He spoke of Addie Mae Collins, of Mr. Dent's cracked ribs, of the burned shoe, of a world he had once dismissed. He admitted his fear, not of history, but of what it might ask of him. "I thought power meant being louder than everyone else," he said, "but it's not. Real power is listening and letting it change you." For those who have spent decades watching the next generation stumble forward, this moment felt like a kind of grace. Not a perfect transformation, but a step. A boy letting go of his armor. A heart finally laid bare. No one clapped. Not because they weren't moved, but because the moment itself was too sacred to break. And when Ms. Caldwell finally stood, she didn't offer praise, she offered truth. "What you just witnessed is growth," she said. "Not perfection, not redemption, just a step. And sometimes that's enough." To every parent, teacher, and grandparent who has waited patiently for a young soul to awaken, this was that moment. The moment when silence means understanding and change begins, not in a speech, but in a shift. Preston didn't just speak differently, he stood differently. And perhaps for the first time in his life, he truly belonged. Not because of where he came from, but because of who he was becoming. When the final bell rang, backpacks zipped and laughter spilled into the hallways like water through a broken dam. But Preston didn't move. He waited, still seated, notebook in hand. For all his wealth, all his privilege, he had never understood what it meant to stay behind for the right reasons. Ms. Caldwell stood at the board, erasing the day's lesson with the same calm, steady grace she always carried. She didn't look surprised to see him waiting. In fact, it seemed she had expected it all along. "I didn't come for credit," he said softly. She paused, turned, and met his eyes. "Then why did you come?" He swallowed. "To say thank you." She sat down at her desk, folding her hands like a mother might after a long day, not out of exhaustion, but with quiet wisdom. "That was brave," she said. He shook his head. "No, it was late. It should have come sooner." There was a moment of stillness between them. Not awkward, but real. The kind of silence that only those who've lived through hard truths can sit in without flinching. And then Preston pulled something from his notebook. It was the old newspaper clipping Mr. Dent had shown him, the photo of a teenage Caldwell, eyes fierce behind thick glasses, already fighting for a better world. Beneath it, Preston had written in his own hand, "Thank you for fighting for a classroom that could hold both truth and grace." She read it slowly, then folded it with great care as though it were something fragile and sacred. Her voice was soft but sure. "You've still got a lot of work to do." "I know," he said, "and not everyone's going to forgive you as quickly as this room did. I don't expect them to." She stood and walked to the window, gazing out at the parking lot as students disappeared into the freedom of their weekend. Then, without turning around, she said, "Go earn it, Preston, with your life, not just your words." And that's when it became clear. Redemption isn't a speech. It's not a standing ovation. It's a decision made every day. Growth is quiet, steady, and often invisible to others, but undeniable to those who have chosen to change. Some lessons don't end when the school bell rings. They begin there. As Preston walked out of Ms. Caldwell's classroom for the last time that week, there was no applause, no dramatic goodbye, just a nod, a shared understanding between teacher and student that something sacred had shifted. This wasn't about proving himself to anyone else. This was about becoming someone different when no one was watching. He stepped out into the fading light of the afternoon, but something in him felt brighter. He didn't walk with the weight of guilt, but with the responsibility of growth. Ms. Caldwell's words lingered like a quiet challenge. Go earn it, with your life, not just your words. And perhaps for the first time, he understood what that meant. Because real change doesn't live in speeches. It lives in choices. It lives in the way you treat the stranger, the stories you choose to learn, and the dignity you give others without being asked. Preston had once thought power came from being louder, smarter, richer. But now he saw the truth. Power lies in restraint, in listening, in showing up with humility. For older Americans who have spent decades learning that life's most important lessons often come late, this story rings true. It's not about perfection. It's about the willingness to grow even when it's uncomfortable, to seek truth even when it hurts, to walk back into the world with softer eyes, stronger values, and a deeper understanding of what it means to belong to something greater than yourself. Preston left the classroom a changed young man, not because someone demanded it, but because someone believed he could. That belief, that grace, is the quiet gift of a great teacher. And for those of us who have spent a lifetime trying to pass down lessons that matter, this is the dream, that one day the seeds we plant in silence will bloom in someone else's courage. Ms. Caldwell never needed the last word. She simply held the line, and Preston, to his credit, crossed it, not in defiance but in faith, because some of the most powerful apologies are never spoken. They're lived. Some stories end quietly, not with applause, but with a nod of respect and a heart forever changed. Preston's journey wasn't about redemption, it was about awakening. And Ms. Caldwell, with her steady grace and unwavering truth, didn't just teach him history, she helped him see his place within it. For those of us who have weathered the years, this story is a gentle reminder it's never too late to grow, to listen, and to become more than we were yesterday. Sometimes the greatest legacy we leave behind isn't in what we say, but in how we choose to live.